No lies, that would be nice, wouldn't it? No lies, I mean, who likes being lied to? But here's the thing, if no one could lie, if all of us were somehow magically imbued with some kind of truth serum where we couldn't help but tell the truth all the time, 24/7, that would be a pretty crappy superpower to have because sometimes telling the truth can get you killed. Think about this, if someone's trying to mug you, they say, "Hey man, I got a gun. Give me your wallet." What are you gonna do in that situation? Are you gonna be like, "Hey man, you don't actually have a gun. You're holding a water gun, and also, I'm kind of scared right now, not a good strategy." In that case, it would actually be better to lie and say something like, "Okay, sure, whatever you want, here's my wallet, don't shoot me." And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, come on, Lawrence, in that scenario, you should just be honest and tell him you're gonna get shot either way. So why not be honest? And that is a very interesting point. I hadn't considered that. And I suppose that if you had nothing to lose and you really wanted to go out in a blaze of glory, then sure, be honest. But for the rest of us normal folk, sometimes it's better to keep our mouths shut and hope for the best rather than speak the truth and risk getting killed. In fact, think about all the times when people lie to protect themselves or others from harm. For example, think about those times when you said you liked a movie or a TV show or a book when really you didn't. Think about how many arguments you might have avoided if you could have just lied and said, "Oh yeah, I loved it." Well, turns out lying can actually save you from getting into an argument. According to research, people who lie more often have fewer arguments. Now, that doesn't mean that people who tell the truth always end up in arguments, but it does seem that telling the truth can make arguments more likely to happen. This has been demonstrated in a number of studies. For example, in one study, researchers sat people down and played them a series of videos of people arguing. Some of the videos were of strangers arguing over neutral topics like whether Superman was a good guy or a bad guy. Other videos were of people arguing over controversial topics like abortion or the death penalty. After watching these videos, participants were asked how often they thought people lied in arguments. They also filled out a questionnaire measuring their own levels of agreeableness, extroversion, neuroticism, and openness to experience. It turned out that people who scored high in neuroticism and low in agreeableness were more likely to say that people lied a lot during the arguments they had just watched. These same people also reported that they themselves argued a lot. So it seems that people who are prone to getting into arguments are also the ones who notice lies in arguments more often. So why do these people notice lies in arguments more often? Well, one possibility is that people who score high in neuroticism and low in agreeableness are more hostile towards other people. Hostility makes it more likely that you'll misinterpret other people's behavior. You'll see them as being more aggressive and more negative than they actually are. This means you're more likely to perceive lies as being present in arguments. But there's another possibility. Maybe people who tend to get into arguments are better at spotting lies, and this skill causes them to get into more arguments because they're constantly calling people out on their lies. But why would this be a skill? Well, imagine that you're a little kid and your mom asks you where you were last night. If you tell the truth, saying, "I was hanging out with Billy and we went to the movies," your mom might be like, "Oh, that's nice," and leave you alone. But if she thinks you're lying, she might start asking tougher questions to try to figure out if you were out past curfew. She might ask, "Oh, so you were with Billy, did you stay at his house?" And then you might crack and admit that you weren't exactly where you told her you were going to be. Now, I'm not advocating that parents interrogate their kids. I have no idea if that's effective. But this is an example of how knowing that someone is lying to you can lead to more scrutiny, which can lead to more lies. It seems that being able to spot lies quickly and efficiently is an effective way to prevent other people from lying to you. Now, unfortunately, being good at spotting lies doesn't necessarily translate into being good at telling the truth. Sometimes we feel compelled to lie even when there's no good reason to do so. For example, Let's say you're driving and you get pulled over by the police. Even though speeding tickets are technically only misdemeanors, studies show that most people lie to cops and say they weren't speeding. Now, this probably isn't the best strategy since if you're innocent, you shouldn't mind if the cop searches your car, right? But hey, I'm not the lying police. Also, according to research, most of the time people lie to the police because they think it will make the interaction go away faster. Basically, they're lying to save themselves some time. But there's a problem with this strategy because when people lie to the police, it makes the officers less likely to believe anything they say, including when they're telling the truth. A number of studies have found that lying to the police increases the likelihood that officers will assume the suspect is guilty, even if they have evidence that they're innocent. This makes sense because if you're willing to lie to the police once, they have no way of knowing whether or not you're lying now. Of course, this doesn't mean that everyone who has ever lied to the police is guilty of whatever they're being accused of, but it does mean that the police are less likely to believe anything that person says going forward. Of course, this is just one possible consequence of lying to the police. In some cases, it could be much worse. For example, in the United States, there is something called the Fifth Amendment, which protects citizens from being forced to testify against themselves. The police can't force you to answer their questions if doing so might incriminate you. However, the Fifth Amendment only applies in court. Outside of court, the police can ask you any questions they want, and if you refuse to answer, they can use your silence against you. For example, if you were in a car accident and you refused to answer the police officer's questions about what happened, the officer could later testify in court that you refused to answer his questions, which could make a jury think that you were hiding something. Because of this, refusing to answer the police's questions is only a good strategy if you're innocent. If you're guilty, the Fifth Amendment protects you from being forced to testify against yourself. But the downside is that the police can use your silence against you in court. That's a pretty big downside. I guess that's why lying to the police is illegal, which means that if you're going to lie to the police, you better have a good excuse. If we lived in a world without lying, though, do you know what would happen? People would be arrested left and right for refusing to answer the police's questions. The courts would be flooded with lawsuits claiming that people's rights were violated because they were arrested for exercising their right to remain silent. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's actually not too far off from what happened in Nazi Germany. When Hitler rose to power, he made lying to the police a criminal offense. He did this to make it easier to track down and arrest people who opposed him. And the law stuck around long after Hitler was gone. In fact, it wasn't until 1990 that West Germany passed a law guaranteeing citizens the right to remain silent when questioned by the police. So I guess that's one of the downsides of living in a world without lying. Another downside is that it would be impossible to negotiate peace deals. Throughout history, there have been countless treaties and peace deals that have ended wars. Most of these agreements involve some degree of lying. For example, in World War II, the Allies knew that D-Day would be a major turning point in the war. Because of this, before the attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt told Great Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill that the American public wouldn't be ready to support a cross-channel invasion until November. FDR figured that by telling Churchill this, the British wouldn't launch any attacks that would jeopardize the surprise attack plan for June. Now, obviously, that was a lie. Roosevelt never expected Americans to be ready to support the war effort. In November, he just needed time to prepare his people for the attack that would eventually take place in June. Of course, telling the truth would have been better in the long run. Had Roosevelt been honest with Churchill about the American public's support for the war, the Allies might have been able to prepare earlier and potentially win the war even sooner. But in the short run, telling the truth could have endangered the lives of thousands of soldiers. So again, sometimes lying is necessary to avoid a worse outcome. Unfortunately, due to the nature of human relationships, lying seems to be unavoidable. We all lie to each other all the time, and it's probably for the best. Who knows? Maybe if we all stopped lying tomorrow, There would be so many arrests that prisons would be full within a week.